This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at Progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, September 26, 1983, a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces basically saved the world. There's a good chance that you know this story or the basic contours of it. It's the height of the Cold War. Stanislav Petrov is manning a bunker near Moscow which monitored the Soviet early warning satellite systems for nuclear attacks. And on this day, those systems started to warn about an incoming nuclear missile attack originating from the United States. But Petrov kept his cool. He ignored the first warning and then another even more dire warning just a little bit later. He had every right, and maybe even duty, we'll get into that, to escalate this matter and kick Soviet nuclear retaliation protocols into effect. But he did not. And the story goes that Petrov was right. There was no actual nuclear strike underway. It was a glitch. And the nightmare scenario of the Soviets retaliating and then the United States inevitably retaliating, well, that nightmare scenario was avoided. So let's talk about Stanislav Petrov's decision and the larger context of U.S. and Russian nuclear showdowns. Shout out to listener Nick, by the way, for suggesting this one. Really interesting. He suggested it way back in February, but here we are in September doing it. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Happy Stanislav Petrov Day. He saved the world. There. I figure he should get a day.
Yeah, he should get a day.
Sure.
That's true, although we'll see. Also, by the way, I mentioned Nick wrote us way back in February. We're doing it now. Listeners, what I do is I go into our inbox and I literally just search the month. And so as long as you put the date in, I searched September, and there were emails from all over the map saying, do this show in September. So there you go. But just make sure you know, and actually emailing us way ahead of time is better because it gives us time to prep. Anyway, let's move on. And actually, before we get to Petrov's very tense moment, I do think there's this larger context that we should lay out. There's obviously the big context of, the Cold War, nuclear armament on both sides. There's also more specific context of fall of 1983 does seem like a particularly tense time in which fears and paranoia, both by the U.S. and Russia, are really, really high.
It's so interesting because when this idea first came through as a suggestion, I had just seen kind of we're on the brink of the Cold War moment. And I thought it was an entirely different event, something called Able Archer, which happens in 1983. Again, one of those times when things were happening, the Soviets are misinterpreting it. There's a lot of tension. You're on the brink of nuclear war again. 1983 is when Ronald Reagan talks about the evil empire for the first time. He's escalating in many ways the tensions around the Cold War, and the Soviets, who keep running through different leaders. At this point in time, it's Yuri Andropov, are not doing a lot to de-escalate either. And so there is this moment in 1983 where, it's a bad year if you don't want to be nuked.
Yeah. And particularly this idea that there would be a surprise attack from one side or the other.
Yeah.
And so, that trickles all the way down into that bunker that Petrov is sitting in.
Yeah. And the idea that this is a massive domino effect. I mean, the idea of it being tit for tat and back and forth until utter oblivion is what everyone feared, that the moment they get hit, all right, we're going to hit you right back. And, that sort of retaliatory response is one I think puts everyone on edge.
Yeah, well, it's like the downside, to state the obvious, the downside of mutually assured destruction is mutually assured destruction.
Everyone dies.
So, yes, there you go.
Big downside.
Yeah,
I know.
So here we are in this bunker with Stanislav Petrov on September 26, 1983. Let's go beat by beat. I guess actually this is where I should reveal that there is the story that emerged and the version that I think is kind of has shown up in movies or, I think this is the kind of thing that shows up in all those, I don't know, books that kids read of like interesting facts or interesting. It just feels like one of those, like there's a paragraph about it. It's super riveting. I just feel like it shows up all. So let's do that simple paragraph version and we'll complicate it a little bit. But what is the simple paragraph version of what goes down in that tense hour inside that bunker?
Well, Stanislav Petrov is a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces. He's down in this bunker near Moscow, and he is monitoring this command center for the early warning satellites. And the early warning satellites were supposed to be the Soviets' first warning that there were incoming intercontinental ballistic missiles, that the U.S. had launched a strike against them. And just a little bit after midnight, the bunker's computers start saying, "Mer, mer, mer." One intercontinental ballistic missile heading from the United States to the Soviet Union. This is the moment that they had been waiting for at this point for like 40 years,
right,
for this first strike to happen. And he's sitting there, and Petrov has to assess what's happening. And here is kind of the upside of mutual assured destruction. It had been drilled into Petrov and the Soviets and the folks in the U.S. that if there was going to be a first strike, that first strike would be overwhelming. Nobody's sending one nuke. Yeah. They're going to send hundreds of nukes. And so he has to make a call. And he makes the call, okay, probably a computer error.
That's what's so crazy to me is like, that's not for real. Like, I think that, I mean, if you think about the fact that like the strategy of it all is the idea that the United States, like you said, NIki, will send off a bunch of missiles to disarm any ability to see a nuke coming. So there would be multiple explosions sort of happening all at once. And then sort of like a major nuke that would come after that. So the fact that you have sort of this lone wolf smells a little fishy, I think, to Petrov. But also the fact that he's able to sort of keep his calm and know that it's more likely to be human error than anything else, I think is telling.
Yeah, and I mean, to me, this is as much a story about that rational decision as we just described, but it's as much a story about kind of like an emotional decision and peer pressure and so forth. Because, by all accounts, there's like 200 people watching him as he's literally holding the phone, his superiors on the other side, and he has to basically say, like, this is real or this is not. And so I have the calm to make that calculus, but also have the calm to kind of like push back against what I think is probably a sort of, a real sense of peer pressure in that moment.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. And the stakes could not be higher. Yeah. If you were wrong, your country gets wiped off the map.
Right.
And you get the blame. Right? You're the one person holding the system together. And it's not just that one call that he has to make, because a little later, the computers go off again.
Glitch again.
And now they're like, oh, one wasn't enough for you? Now there are 4.
Right.
Now what are you going to do, big guy? And he makes the same decision. He's like, it's got to be a computer error.
Right. And again, it is rational to me to say, like, the whole point of a preemptive attack is to wipe out the retaliatory capabilities, and so to only send 1 or even only send 4. But I just think about being in that moment as the real act.
I don't think from a moral perspective that I would be willing to retaliate, like to be willing to say, like, get the guns ready, I think that there is if you think about the fact that if you're going to get hit by a nuclear bomb, the losses there regardless. You may not even be alive to sort of like retaliate. But I mean, when I think about what could happen if he was wrong versus what could happen if he was right, like I would still want to err on the side of caution. Yeah.
Though, within a bureaucracy, right, and within a militaristic culture, I feel like the decision to take action is often the safest one. If he had said, this is real, let's retaliate, I mean, he may not have been around. No one would have been around necessarily to talk about it. But there is safety in saying, "Well, it was a computer error. What could I do? I just read I just read the signals and I acted accordingly."
And thinking about the pressure, I mean, I mentioned earlier that this is in the brief reign of Yuri Andropov, who's only a Soviet premier for like 15 months because they kept putting old people in place and the old people kept dying. But Andropov was obsessed with the idea that
Yeah.
the U.S. was going to launch a sneak attack. Certainly the bellicose rhetoric coming out of Washington was not helping this, but like there would have been a lot of pressure within that bureaucracy to suspect that the U.S. was going to strike and then to be like, oh, it's happening, right? The thing that we have been sort of teed up for is getting ready to happen. And so I think that it does make Petrov kind of a hero in that moment, because it could have very easily gone the other direction.
Yeah.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting the world together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
That pressure, can't be overstated, including one of my favorite details from this is, the room is going crazy. There's 200 people looking at him. He's on the phone with his superiors. There's apparently another officer shouting at him to remain calm.
That always works.
Always
you guys have kids, like when you yell at them to calm down.
Calm down, stay calm, make the right decision, do your job.
Actually, nothing enrages me more than someone saying calm down.
Right. Oh, yeah. Right. But he does make this decision, and we've hinted at it a number of times, but his calculus is, one, any preemptive attack isn't going to be at this scale, right? And then, moreover, I think another really compelling kind of calculus is, and what this must mean is it's a computer malfunction, which, might be the sort of logical conclusion, but there is an element there of like, not only am I just making a decision in real time, but I'm also like questioning our capabilities in this moment, right? And I think to pull back to that larger context of both sides rushing towards capability and paranoia, part of this story is that the Russians built a system that was glitchy because there was so much pressure to ramp up these capabilities. And, the satellite system presented a 15-minute advantage over ground radar, right? And, that makes a huge difference, 15 minutes of extra warning. And so, again, it's just this push, this technological push, and you get to a place where things are glitchy and they don't work, and the downside can be, really, really disastrous.
And what I think is also interesting about this is that Petrov is not sort of hailed as the savior of the world. It's like, he saved us from utter chaos. It was literally sort of like a CYA situation where it was like, oh, listen, we can't give you an award because this is going to make us look bad. It's going to make us look like we don't have control of our technology. It's going to make the scientists look like they don't know what they're doing. It's not going to reflect highly on us. And so it's better for us to just sort of, I don't know, slap you on the back, attaboy, and keep it moving, than to sort of like give him, I think, the honor that should be bestowed upon anyone that would stop this sort of like cataclysmic war that would take place.
Yeah, that idea that you can't reveal the weakness of the system suggests a kind of corrosion or corruption in the system that leads to incidents like this, right? If there can't be open communication, if everyone's terrified of being sanctioned or worse, it discourages moments like this, which I also think just like amplifies Petrov's courage in bucking a system.
Totally. Yeah. So I want to circle back a little to that and talk about legacy and kind of his place in history, but that's related to the, single paragraph version of this story that has emerged that I was referring to earlier that I think deserves a little bit of complexifying. Is that the right word?
Complexity?
Complexification. But, one thing worth saying is often I hear this portrayed as he disobeyed orders and took this stand. And, I don't know, for what it's worth, don't think there's reports that he did that, right? No one was saying, make this call, this is it. And he stood athwart that. He made his judgment in the way that he was supposed to. And then there's also this other element that there is reporting that, there were a couple of protocols in place. It wasn't like he was the one with his finger on the button to launch the attack. That even if he had said, I think this is real, that would have then maybe gone up the chain, but then someone else was potentially in a position to say, well, maybe it's not. So, it's worth saying that stuff, in part because when you look at other incidents of near disaster, there's one around the Cuban Missile Crisis that really is like someone standing there with his superiors telling them this is a nuclear attack, and him saying, no, I refuse, and like actual disobeying of orders. So, not to...
I feel like I have seen this scene in like an episode of Jack Ryan
or
something, where some Tom Clancy film where this gets played out over and over again, where it's like, push the button. I don't know why it always gets reduced down to a button, but like, push the button, and then like that's supposed to like unleash World War IV or something like that. But like it,
I like that you cut the World War IV.
Jumping right ahead.
No, you're watching advanced level
That's right.
movies here.
But we always make it down to one person. I do think that part of the fail safe is that there are multiple levels of like approval that have to take place before these things are actually launched.
Yeah.
But I think it also speaks to how intense that existential fear was around nuclear weapons, but also an awareness that there are these systems in place, and maybe the systems aren't good. Maybe it's going to take someone who's not following orders, and it very much makes sense in a post-World War II, sort of post-Nuremberg moment, that the hero of all of these stories is somebody who stood up and said, I'm not going to follow orders. I'm going to break from the system. It's interesting to think about all the tensions that are playing into why we have so many of those guy about to push the button moments.
Totally.
But is it like, there's something about this year, 1983, where I just can't get my head around the statistic, which is the fact that the Soviets had 35,804 nuclear warheads, and the United States is like a little over 23,000.
Yeah.
I don't know why in the world you would need this many nuclear warheads. Like, I mean,
to destroy the Earth 50 times over.
It's just there's no. I mean, there's no need in the world for that kind of military power.
It's posturing, right? It's one-upsmanship. As much as the stakes are real, it's as much about rhetoric and posturing and fear as it is about actual capability. Which in
brinksmanship.
Yeah, brinksmanship. Which in some twisted way, you could view this Petrov story as this is exactly what the system was supposed to do. It was supposed to go right up to the edge and put people in impossible situations. Like, that is mutually assured destruction. That is the sort of fear that was keeping everyone. And so, we see this as like an anomaly. But, I think, NIki, you were hinting at this. It's like when you decide to live in this world, you're asking for these situations, and almost you're
inviting them.
You're inviting them, and it's by design, you know. And so you need these.
And how many times have we covered an episode in which somebody drops a wrench,
right.
or some sort of tool, and almost sets off World War III or whatever?
I'm starting to think nuclear weapons are not a good idea, you guys.
There you go.
I think you're onto something.
Yeah, you might be onto something. I like so much see this story as just kind of tells us so much about bureaucracies and decision making within bureaucracies. We've done so many stories that feel like they're that, and as we said, this sort of aftermath of this story and the way that Petrov is neither rewarded nor punished and just kind of like acknowledged as neutral within the Soviet bureaucracy says so much about kind of how systems work, that they couldn't even go out of their way to acknowledge that he'd done this thing because it would be admitting some sort of failure or weakness. That said, he does get his flowers, as they say. I mean, he is often referred to as the man who saved the world. Nick's email, not that Nick is the arbiter of the world's moral judgment, but Nick's,
I think he is.
Yeah. Well, Nick was like, Nick's email was like, Stanislav Petrov saves all human life on Earth, was Nick's email to us. And he kind of, I think that's how that story has seeped into the ether.
Well, there's a documentary, too, that came out in 2014 called The Man Who Saved the World.
Well, there you go. And what else? He died in 2017, not that long ago. But in recent years, he's visited the United States a number of times. I feel like the U.S. has kind of lauded him more, per se.
Yeah, I mean, this was a story that wasn't known until the fall of the Soviet Union. And then as it gets put out there, I mean, it is part of this retrospective of, like, what a crazy time that was.
Yeah.
Like, when he dies, the New York Times runs an obituary of him because he was seen by that point as a significant enough figure to be, lauded at the moment of his death.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, as we wrap up, I should also throw in there, what was the glitch? Well, it was sunlight hitting high-altitude clouds at a very strange angle and setting off something on the satellites. So there you go. That was what led to...
So we blaming the sun.
Blame the sun.
Blaming the sun.
It all comes back. I mean, it's really is the first nuclear weapon. So there you go.
Really?
So, all right, we will leave it there. Thank you, Nick, for the email, and thanks to you, Nicole Hemmer.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is an all-in-one management software with apps for every business need. Odoo has apps for CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, manufacturing, and everything in between. And they're all in one easy-to-use software. And the best part about Odoo? All Odoo apps are integrated, helping you get things done faster and more efficiently. So, when you think about business, think Odoo. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's ODOO.com/thisday.
Radiotopia.
From